November 19th, 1989. In East Berlin, a 54-year-old construction worker named Klaus Hoffmann sat watching television when an extraordinary announcement appeared. The border had been opened. At first, he could not accept it as real. Less than an hour later, he found himself standing near the Brandenburg Gate, watching citizens from East Germany pass through checkpoints that only 2 days earlier could have resulted in gunfire. Tears filled his eyes. Around him, countless others were crying as well. The images broadcast around the world captured the political significance of that night. What they did not reveal was the financial reality unfolding behind the scenes. 3 weeks before those historic scenes, inside a government building unfamiliar to most East Germans and inaccessible to nearly all of them, the East German State Bank completed an internal assessment. Its conclusion was direct. The country was effectively insolvent. The hard currency obligations owed to Western lenders could no longer be supported by existing income. The numbers were unmistakable. The German Democratic Republic required approximately 35 billion marks in hard currency every year, simply to maintain basic operations and keep store shelves minimally supplied. Its actual hard currency earnings were only about 12 billion. For years, that shortfall had been concealed through Soviet assistance, accounting maneuvers, and the unwillingness of political leaders to publicly acknowledge what financial officials already understood. The wall did not collapse solely because people demanded liberty. It collapsed because the state supporting the entire system had quietly exhausted the practical ability to sustain the promises it had made. China has not reached that point, but the framework supporting its guarantees is moving along a path that resembles the one East Germany followed during the years leading up to 1989. When a system depends almost entirely on implicit guarantees, the failure of those guarantees does not appear first as a conventional market crisis. Instead, it emerges when the distance between promises and deliverable reality becomes too large to conceal. The economic breakdown of the Soviet system between 1989 and 1991 remains widely misunderstood because it never resembled a traditional default while it was happening. There was no missed bond payment, no dramatic credit downgrade, no bankruptcy declaration. What occurred instead was a gradual and accelerating erosion of the unwritten assurances that Soviet citizens had long accepted as part of daily life. The Soviet social contract was clear, even though it was rarely written down. The government guaranteed employment, not necessarily meaningful work, not necessarily efficient work, but employment. Housing was provided at minimal cost. Food prices remained controlled. People expected that a ruble held today would purchase roughly what it had purchased the previous year. These were not legal protections backed by enforceable rights. They were assumptions that had existed since the era of Stalin and had become deeply embedded in public expectations. What weakened those assurances was not ideology, it was mathematics. By the late 1980s, the Soviet economy was operating through two separate realities that were moving farther apart with increasing speed. One reality was official. It consisted of reported statistics, planned production targets, and government price controls. On paper, the economy appeared stable and moderately expanding. The other reality was the one people experienced: actual factory output, real product availability in stores, the true purchasing power of wages. Those indicators were moving in the opposite direction. They were shrinking. For a time, the widening gap between official claims and actual conditions was covered by oil revenue subsidies. Then, oil prices collapsed in 1986. The support disappeared. The gap became visible. Store shelves that had once been barely stocked became largely empty. Wages that had previously covered essential needs no longer did so. Employment guarantees continued to exist in form, while the enterprises paying those wages increasingly lost the ability to manufacture products that anyone wanted to buy. The Soviet default occurred when a sufficient number of citizens reached the same conclusion at the same time. The state could no longer fulfill the terms it had implicitly promised. Gorbachev's policy of glasnost accelerated that process. In a system built upon unwritten guarantees, transparency itself became a force that exposed the weakening foundation beneath them. The moment people became able to see the distance between the promise and the lived reality, that distance stopped functioning as a workable arrangement. The default was not the insolvency itself. The insolvency existed. The default was the revelation. China's system of implicit guarantees is larger in scale, more advanced in design, and far more integrated into the financial structure than anything the Soviet system ever possessed. That is exactly why a breakdown would carry greater consequences, and why the comparison with the Soviet sequence is closer than many surface differences imply. The clearest example begins with real estate. Between 2000 and 2021, Chinese households purchased approximately 90 million apartments that did not yet exist. Buyers paid the full purchase price in advance to developers who pledged completion within 2 to 4 years. The protection behind those transactions was never formally written into law. It existed as an assumption. The belief was that the state would never permit developers to collect payment and then fail to deliver homes because such an outcome would directly violate the understanding between the Communist Party and China's middle class. That understanding was simple. Work hard, save consistently, trust the system. In return, the system will not take what belongs to you. Since 2021, more than 50 major developers have entered default. Around 20 million apartments that were fully paid for remain unfinished. The individuals who purchased them continue making mortgage payments on properties they have never received. Some homeowners responded by organizing mortgage payment boycotts, refusing to continue servicing loans connected to undelivered units. The government's approach has focused on extending deadlines, supplying limited funding to finish selected developments, and managing the problem without formally stating that the underlying guarantee has already failed. That approach mirrors the Soviet pattern. The separation between the official narrative and actual conditions continues to exist because authorities refuse to acknowledge it directly. Soviet economic planners followed the same method with industrial production data during the late 1980s. The discrepancy existed. Recognition was postponed. The postponement remained effective until it no longer could. The visible problem is property. Beneath that layer lies local government financing vehicle debt. The total stands at roughly $9 trillion in obligations created through off-balance sheet structures used by local governments to finance the infrastructure expansion that supported the housing boom. Those entities now confront the same collapse in revenue experienced by developers. Income from land sales, which previously funded interest obligations, has declined by more than 40% from its peak. The central government has been gradually absorbing these liabilities. It is quietly transferring them onto the official balance sheet through methods that relocate the debt without reducing its overall size. This reflects the Soviet subsidy model operating in the opposite direction. In the Soviet system, Moscow moved resources from the center outward to preserve the appearance of stability. In China, Beijing is moving obligations from the outer layers back toward the center in order to prevent an openly recognized failure. The direction has changed. The mechanism has not. Central resources are being used to stop a distributed problem from becoming a visible crisis. This is where the Soviet comparison becomes more than structural. It becomes predictive. The meaning of default in this context requires precision because it differs from the definition used by most financial analysts. China is not expected to announce a traditional sovereign default. It is not expected to miss an interest payment on a dollar-denominated bond. It is not Argentina. The default being described is the same kind experienced by the Soviet Union. It is the point at which the implicit guarantees holding together the political and economic system can no longer all be maintained at the same time, forcing the state to decide which promises must be openly abandoned. The Soviet government confronted that decision between 1989 and 1991. It could no longer preserve the employment guarantee, the guarantee of food prices, and the guarantee of currency stability simultaneously. Authorities attempted to sustain all three. Within 24 months, all three were lost. China now faces a similar convergence. China cannot preserve every implicit commitment at the same time. It cannot fully uphold the expectation held by the 20 million families waiting for unfinished apartments. It cannot simultaneously protect depositors whose banks carry massive losses that remain largely unrecognized. It cannot guarantee the incomes of local government employees whose pay depends on budgets supported by LGFV financing. And it cannot completely secure the promises made to retirees within a pension system facing severe demographic pressure. Taken individually, each obligation may be manageable. Taken together, while the property market continues to contract and land-related income continues to weaken, they demand resources that are becoming increasingly difficult for the state to supply. The Soviet Union encountered the same reality in 1989. The collapse in oil prices removed the outside support that had been covering the cost of maintaining multiple guarantees at once. China's comparable sources of support, export earnings, and land sale revenues that sustain the guarantee structure have been declining in real terms since 2021. When the Soviet government lost the ability to sustain every guarantee simultaneously, it began allowing some commitments to deteriorate while protecting others. Bare store shelves reflected the breakdown of the food price commitment. Factories that had stopped functioning while workers remained employed represented the preservation of employment at the expense of productive output. Citizens understood what those signals meant. Confidence did not disappear overnight. It eroded gradually as visible failures accumulated. Eventually, enough evidence existed for people to recognize that the unwritten agreement could no longer be sustained. The significance extends far beyond China's borders. China's network of implicit guarantees reaches into the international system as well. The Belt and Road Initiative accounts for approximately $1 trillion in Chinese infrastructure lending across more than 150 countries. Many of those projects rest on their own assumption. The expectation that China, as lender and partner, will continue providing the stability required for those projects to operate successfully. Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Zambia. Each of these countries entered debt restructuring discussions involving Chinese loans because the projects financed by those loans failed to generate the revenue necessary for repayment. China managed those restructurings through bilateral negotiations and largely outside public attention. A China experiencing domestic fiscal strain possesses far less capacity to support those external commitments. At the same time, it is managing pressures at home. During its final years, the Soviet Union remained, in theory, the sponsor of numerous client states. Reality proved different. Financial support diminished. Subsidies stopped arriving. Those states were forced to redefine their positions without the backing they had previously relied upon. The geopolitical consequences of a China that cannot simultaneously maintain both external and internal guarantees would be substantial for nations whose development strategies depend heavily on Chinese investment. The key issue is the mechanism rather than the headline. The Soviet default never appeared as a conventional entry in a credit rating database. No alert flashed across financial terminals. Instead, there was an internal report from a state bank in November 1989 stating that the numbers no longer added up. There was also a political leadership that had spent years preventing that conclusion from becoming publicly acknowledged. Klaus Hoffmann stood at the Brandenburg Gate on that historic night because enough people had witnessed enough broken promises to conclude that the underlying agreement had already failed. Official recognition arrived afterward. The real default had been unfolding long before it was admitted. China's own implicit arrangement now shows visible signs of strain. The effort to manage those pressures is real and highly sophisticated. Yet the mathematics beneath the surface remains. It is the same kind of arithmetic that officials at the Soviet State Bank confronted in November 1989. And arithmetic does not change simply because an official narrative says otherwise. If this analysis gave you a new perspective, share your thoughts and continue following the discussion for future developments and historical comparisons.